Good day, everyone. We'll start in 1 minute. Thank you for logging on today and joining us. See some people from the police, some of our international colleagues as well, some individuals from the nonprofit sector here in Bermuda. Thank you for joining us today. Okay, so thank you for joining today. So today's webinar is titled International Perspectives on Problem and Responsible Gambling, Current Challenges and Future Concerns. So this is part of our Problem Gambling Awareness Month, which is the first time Bermuda was participating in it. It's the 20th anniversary of Problem Gambling Awareness Month, actually. On the 31st of March, there's another webinar that's going to be hosted by Bermuda's Problem Gaming Council as well, called Introduction to Problem and Responsible Gaming. You can go to www.bgc.bm/webinars to register for that webinar as well. So just to do some housekeeping. After the second half of the session, we will be doing a question and answer period as well. I imagine that hopefully will inspire some fruitful discussion today and just introduce the field of problem and responsible gaming from the perspective of policymakers and the sort of considerations that they take into account when designing problem responsible gaming programs and the like. So to put it more bluntly, what exactly is problem and responsible gaming, and why is it important for policymakers to understand? This is a very critical question. So at a first glance, problem and responsible gaming appears to have some obvious definitions. So problem gaming is all gambling behavior patterns that compromise, disrupts, or damages personal, family, or vocational pursuits. And one could summarize responsible gaming as a set of practices that seeks to maximize safety for people that choose gambling as a form of entertainment that they individually enjoy. But I think both of these miss the mark a little bit, and that it doesn't convey that problem and responsible gaming is actually a field of compliance within the world of gaming regulation. So just like with financial services and other like industries, there's anti-money laundering regimes, there's anti-terror funding regimes, and those are critical and part of the bedrock for compliance for those industries. But with gambling, we actually have an additional bucket of compliance, if you will, right? That's a field within itself, an additional bucket of work. And that's problem with responsible gaming as well. Viewing it as an additional bucket of work that stands on its own from other forms of regulation within the gambling world. So a field of compliance that has its own international norms, standards, and debates and disagreements. Like other fields, the gambling industry is very fast-paced and rapidly evolving. In fact, gambling is more akin, in the eyes of some people, to international big tech than anything else. So online gaming has particularly just completely changed the gambling landscape, where in many jurisdictions, it's effectively a gray market. So what may be a law-abiding online licensee in one jurisdiction might face criminal liability in another. So this is forcing a lot of jurisdictions, even ones that have outright bans or significantly restrict gambling altogether, to adopt problem and responsible gaming measures into their public health initiatives. Some popular video games for youth simulate or outright have components of gambling embedded within them. This is especially troubling as we know that most individuals that are diagnosed with gambling addiction report learning how to gamble from a very young age. Brick and mortar establishments constantly tweak models, adopt new forms of tech, and experiment with different approaches to mathematically increase profits over time. By granting licensees a license to have any kind of gambling establishment, jurisdictions take on an ethical and practical obligation to maximize patron safety and the safety of the public at large. And this isn't really any exception to Bermuda as well. So in terms of current data, so the last time a prevalence study was done for Bermuda was in 2022, and the results came out in March. So just from the best of our knowledge at this time, about 2% of Bermuda residents reported of having problems of gaming in their lifetime. And that's really about average. So if you look at the United States, the average, depending on how you calculate it, it's about 2.2%. And there's some debate that goes into that. So but the long story short is that when it comes to problem gaming, despite there not being a land-based casino operator, the actual incidences of problem gaming are about average. And 7% of residents who agree that they had gambled in the past 12 months, so people who actively enjoy gambling, they report that they've done it within the past year, have entered into agreements with overseas casino establishments to enter into a period of self-exclusion. So they have, recognized that they have had some kind of problem, some kind of issue, and have entered an agreement with an overseas operator, barring themselves from entering that premise. And the potential consequences of that varying somewhat a little bit by jurisdiction, but being trespassed from the property, electing to have yourself trespassed from the property if you were to return. So meeting and understanding international problem responsible gaming norms is critical. This is especially true since different regulatory structures rely more and more on reciprocity. Regulators depend more and more on due diligence reporting from other jurisdictions, honoring vendor or gaming machine licenses from other jurisdictions as well. Not taking this seriously as a bucket of work within its own, and not taking problem responsible gambling norms surrounding, let's say, education, regulatory philosophy, or not properly setting up an infrastructure such as a helpline or investing money into counseling services is a mistake that can affect international reputation within the regulatory space. So it's critical that we learn from our colleagues from other jurisdictions as to what concerns they have about the gaming industry. And so that's the purpose of today, where we have colleagues from 3 different jurisdictions who are going to be represented today, just to give their perspective on what do they see as the challenges in the future, and what do they see as the challenges in the gaming industry as it exists today, particularly with the rise of online gaming, which again, in many jurisdictions is effectively a gray market. So we have 3 panelists here today. This is Linda Graves, who's Executive Director, the National Association of Administrators of Disordered Gambling Services. Mr. Tim Miller, who is the Executive Director of the UK Gambling Commission. And this is Shelley White, this is Chief Executive Officer of the Responsible Gambling Council. And all 3 of these individuals and the Bermuda Gaming Commission works with from time to time, as they represent the forefront of the conversation around responsible and problem gaming. So, at this time, I guess just to kind of kick off this discussion, to kick off this discussion, I mean, at this time, I guess I'll turn it to Shelley Wyatt. So, what do you see as the current issues and future concerns within the space of problem and responsible gaming?
Sure. Thanks, Nathan. And if you could put up the deck that I sent you, that's great. So hello, everyone. It's great to be here. Nathan, thank you very much for this opportunity and for us to come together and participate in the Bermuda Gaming Commission's Problem Gambling Prevention Month. We've been working with Bermuda for a few years now, and I have to say it's been a real pleasure to work with Nathan and Charmaine and others in the organization because of the commitment to creating a robust regulatory framework with a real focus on responsible gambling and prevention. And I have to say that, just to start off, one of the key trends that we're seeing at the Responsible Gambling Council is that responsible gambling is a priority for regulators and operators around the world. And they understand the importance of this to sustainability and customer protection. The other trend that we're seeing before I get into the next slide is a couple of things that Nathan's already mentioned. One is seeing a growing interest in international collaboration to create a responsible gambling ecosystems. And secondly, a real focus on prevention. And I have to say that focusing on prevention and developing a prevention strategy and earmarking resources for that is where a jurisdiction is going to get the most return on its investment, the best return on an investment. So that focus on prevention right up front. Next slide talks a little bit about who RGC is. Maybe you haven't heard of RGC. We're an independent nonprofit organization. We're based in Canada, but we do work in over 12 different countries on 5 different continents. We're celebrating our 40th year, and all of our work is focused on responsible gambling and its key elements: research, prevention, education, accreditation, strategy and policy development, training, etc. And we work with all gambling partners. We call it a 360 approach, and the public to prevent problem gambling and reduce its risk, promote sustainability and responsible play. There is in the next slide, you talk about the strong case for a regulated and legal market. There's questions about, should gambling even be licensed? And we would say, if you want to create a safer gambling environment for your citizens, for your residents, it's best to have a regulated legal market, because that's the best way to provide consumer protection. It also is beneficial in terms of providing revenue to the government, as opposed to it going offshore or to unlicensed operators. It enables jurisdictions to develop and implement a risk management approach in terms of identifying what are the risks and risk mitigation strategies, and also enables you to develop outcomes. What are the outcomes that you want to achieve? Develop solutions, goals and objectives and solutions, and then actually measure the impact of those solutions. If I go to the next slide and I talk a little bit more about the risk and the risk management and the outcomes based, I already mentioned that it's about, it does generate revenue for the government, for the country, that can be reinvested in important, valuable programs and services like healthcare and education, etc. We know that those jurisdictions that have a robust regulated environment with a focus on the prevention of money laundering, fraud, problem gambling, and other social issues create better social outcomes. And like I said, there tends to be a focus on creating and implementing an outcomes-based kind of approach to the gambling regulation, and allowing operators to develop their strategies based on the required outcomes. In terms of consumer protection, so two parts to regulated environment. One is that revenue, risk mitigation, and outcomes. But the second piece, and that I'm really going to focus on, is really the consumer protection piece. And in the next slide, I talk about, so the definition, and Nathan started the presentation by talking about definitions. The original definition of responsible gambling in at a very high level still is relevant. And what it talks about is each stakeholder has a important role and responsibility to create a responsible gambling culture. So the regulator has a role, the operator, the equipment manufacturers, the game manufacturers, community organizations, public health, responsible gambling organizations. Each key stakeholder plays a very important role in creating that RG culture. And as I said, I can't overemphasize the importance of prevention, education, and information. And thirdly, that, you know, there's an evidence-based approach to doing this work, and that it's culturally sensitive, that it's taking into consideration the values and the beliefs of the people that are living in that jurisdiction. And finally, that there's a scorecard in place where you can, the regulator and the operators can measure their results and their impact. So if we delve a little bit more deeply in the next slide to talk about prevention, education, and information. So the fact that there needs to be player support, there needs to be information provided to individuals about what responsible gambling tools are in place, how the games work, what are the odds, etc., so that they're educated and can make informed decisions about their play. Secondly, that there's helplines available to answer people's questions and enable them to get help. Nathan already mentioned the importance of self-exclusion, and that there's actually a continuum. And some of the newest thinking about self-exclusion has actually been broadened to taking a break. And it's everything from taking a break for 30 minutes after you've played for an hour or so to taking a break for a day or a week, all the way up to taking a break for 1, 2, or 3 years, or maybe even 6 months, to help recalibrate, but also to help people have balance in their lives. For those individuals who are not feeling good about their gambling, counseling is extremely important to provide support to individuals and help them get help as soon as possible. And there should be multiple ways for people to do that. We call it no wrong doors. So whether it's telephone or in person or online or through multiple different organizations that different demographics would use, extremely important. And then finally, treatment, and potentially both inpatient and outpatient treatment, and taking consideration, like I said, gender, culture, etc. Operators should also be very involved in prevention, education, and information. What information do they have at their venues or online about responsible gambling tools and how the games work and where to get help? There's some very promising opportunities that technology can provide. As Nathan mentioned at the beginning, technology is a driving force in the growth and diversification of the gambling industry right now. There's also, it's also a driver in terms of responsible gambling and harm prevention. There's many technology solutions that include artificial intelligence and machine learning and chat boxes and online support and information, websites, etc., that can be even digital games that teach individuals about responsible gambling and how gambling works. So there's so many different ways, exciting ways that technology can be utilized. And the important thing about this is that individuals are using technology. So to provide them with technology solutions makes a lot of sense. And then customer interactions for individuals while they're playing. And if we see a change in their behavior while they're playing, being able to respond to them immediately and provide them with the kind of guidance so that they can reduce their harms going forward. In terms of the evidence-based approach, in the next slide, we talk about evidence-based and culturally sensitive policies, procedures, practices, and programs. A real shift and to data collection and analytics about players' activity, and being able to take that information and develop responsible gambling programs and services and protocols to create a safer gambling environment. Secondly, market segmentation. We're not a homogeneous society, and it's really important to understand the values, the beliefs, and behaviors of young adults versus older adults, men versus women, etc., and create relevant messaging for each of those market segments. And that's absolutely critical. And we've found at RGC that has had a very positive impact on providing individuals with valuable and impactful messaging that they've actually adopted. Research is imperative. We can't make decisions based on gut reaction. We actually have to conduct the research or actually learn from other jurisdictions about what are best practices based on evidence. And that's absolutely imperative. And that's actually something that RGC could help of the work and of the RG strategy to ensure that it's having the desired one product that RGC has is RG Check, and it's an international verified accreditation program that actually audits each operator's our responsible gambling standards and practices and gives them and scores it, much like a financial audit for a company, and lets them know where they're doing really well and where there's opportunities for improvement, and provides them with a strategy for continuous improvement. And what we found is that operators who actually engage in RG Check actually see improvements in their responsible gambling programs and their customer consumer protection programs. And just some examples on the next slide of what the land-based standards are for casinos. It includes, their on operators' responsible gambling policy, strategy, and culture. Secondly, the training that they provide to their employees. Thirdly, what kind of self-exclusion program that they have, how they're assisting players who might be experiencing harms, how they're providing information to their players about how to make informed decisions about their play, marketing communications and the kind of messages that they have to ensure that there are safer gambling messages in their ads and marketing, and access to money. How are they accessing money, and is it too easy for them to access money? So that could contribute to gambling harms. And then also venue and game design in terms of how it's laid out. Is there a kiosk or an area that people can go to where they can, get more information about responsible gambling and player protections, etc.? Are there areas where people can take breaks, whether it's through entertainment or taking a coffee break, or just perhaps sitting down in a lounge area and watching the news or something of that nature? But those building those areas within the venue where people can take breaks is absolutely important. We know that the evidence has verified that. And then lastly, I'd have to say the last, but certainly a very, very important trend in RG is this concept of measuring the results and the impact, and having KPIs in place, key performance indicators, having a scorecard. What do you want to achieve? How are you measuring it, to know what's working and where there's opportunities for improvement? We're seeing a tremendous uptake in ESG. ESG is a strategic report card that corporations are using to measure their environmental, their social, and their governance impact. Corporate social responsibility, how the gambling industry is giving back to the community to support it and reinvest. obtaining player feedback in terms of how supported they feel, and whether or not it's easy for them to access the kind of knowledge and information that they want. What kind of experience are they having? Prevalence studies, Nathan mentioned that at the beginning of the presentation as well. This is really important. You know, what is the incidence of positive play as well as problem gambling, and how is that changing and over time? And then, as I mentioned already, the importance of data collection, analytics, insights. And I know you've just launched your helpline, and Nathan and I've talked about this in terms of the valuable information that you're going to be able to obtain from your helpline in terms of number of calls, who is calling, what are the kinds of questions or concerns that they're bringing forward. So all of these things contribute to a safer gambling culture. Thanks, Nathan.
Thank you. Thank you. That was excellent. Excellent. So the work of the RGCO, Responsible Gaming Council of Ontario, is critical. And the Bermuda Gaming Commission, we work with them quite a bit. Obviously, talked about the helpline consulting. The standards that Bermuda has adopted is more or less in line with the accreditation process that the RG check criteria would be using. There's some modifications that are in there just because of obviously the regulatory structure is different. In Ontario, a lot of the operators are crown corporations as well. That changes the dynamic as opposed to a market where all the operators are completely private. So excellent, thank you. So I guess at this time, turn to Mr. Tim Miller, the Executive Director of the UK Gambling Commission. Afternoon.
Hi, Nathan. Hello, everyone. Really great to be here from the UK. Won't talk for too long. I don't have any slides, so don't want you looking at my face for too long. That's not good for anyone to experience. But a couple of things I really wanted to touch upon. Those that have heard me speak before know I always have a tendency to try and say something a bit controversial. I don't think this will be too bad, but it's worth saying that in the UK, we've effectively kind of banned the phrase responsible gambling. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that, you know, that needs to happen everywhere, but it's worth just understanding why we've done that. And the reason for it was that we felt for a long time it was really used as kind of shorthand for saying that the gambler should be more responsible, to the exclusion of anyone else's responsibility. And our view was that if you're going to address gambling harms, it's actually a really collective effort. Yes, there's individual responsibility, but industry has responsibility, us as a regulator has responsibility, and so do many others. So we talk about the idea of promoting safer gambling rather than responsible gambling. The other reason for moving away from it is that the flip side of responsible gambling is irresponsible gambling. And certainly as a regulator, we did not want to be in the business of being seen to be making values judgments on people's kind of behaviours or actions. So that has very much kind of shaped our thinking. And I think a key moment for us, sort of around about 4 years ago, was I was responsible for creating Britain's first ever national strategy for reducing gambling harms. And the reason for doing this is that we recognise that whilst as a regulator we play an incredibly important role in addressing gambling harms, if you only look to regulate your way out of this, then actually you're not going to be successful. It does require a really joined up effort by a whole range of different organisations and stakeholders. And the national strategy was really an attempt to try and bring everyone together that's got a role to play, to get them working with some shared objectives, to be working much more closely in collaboration with each other, to address the gambling harms that we see in Britain. And one of the reasons I wanted to flag this is I know there's, you know, a range of different organisations on this call today. And the success of the national strategy, I think, was really in the way that we were able to help all these different organisations play their own distinctive part, but in a very joined up way. So we have had around 40 different organisations working with us in implementing the strategy. And a couple of really probably relevant examples to people on the call today. We've worked very closely with the police and with the prison service in Britain to help them play their part in addressing gambling harms. And what that has led to is some pilot projects where in both custody suites, when people have just been arrested, or when people who have been convicted are first entering the prison system, there is now a screening service that goes on to identify people that might have a gambling addiction and that it might have played a part in their criminality. You know, this is something that's very normal when it comes to kind of alcohol abuse, drug addiction, and so on. And we felt there was a real gap there in terms of understanding the relationship between criminality and gambling harms. So that's a really good example of where kind of the police and the prison service worked with us in delivering this national strategy. The other example I would give is the work that we've done with non-profits across Britain. Now, prior to my time at the Gambling Commission, I used to be chair of Britain's largest non-profit that provided advice services. And what we identified was that people would often be needing help and support as a result of their gambling, but wouldn't always recognise it as a gambling issue. So we would have people that would come through our doors with concerns about debt, questions about benefits that they might be entitled to. And actually, when you asked the right questions, what you sometimes found behind those issues was gambling being a driver for some of the issues that they were facing. So we work really closely with non-profits to ensure that their people are appropriately kind of trained and empowered to be able to support people that might be facing gambling harms. And also to make sure that our advice and support services are much more joined up than they used to be. So ensuring that, you know, if someone phones a helpline, but perhaps it's not necessarily quite the right helpline for them, that there's easy ways for them to be transferred perhaps to some of the specialist gambling support services. So that work with non-profits has been really important. But we've worked with people like banks, we've worked with local government, we've worked with academics and others, and it's been a really successful way of addressing gambling harms. And in Britain over the last 5 years, we've seen a year-on-year decline in the headline rate of problem gambling. So clearly this much more collaborative, joined up approach has started to have some impact. Second thing then I'll just kind of quickly touch upon is kind of the international perspective on this. Obviously, you know, coming from the UK and speaking to you today, kind of we see sort of the international context of this. And I think the one kind of really clear message I would give to any country that either is, you know, starting to regulate different forms of gambling, particularly online gambling, is that what happens in one jurisdiction no longer stays in that jurisdiction. We see many of the same companies operating around the world. So companies that deliver online gambling in Britain are increasingly delivering those services in Canada, in North America, and elsewhere. We're seeing many of the same risks in all the different jurisdictions around gambling harms, around anti-money laundering, and so on. And we're seeing many of the same challenges in terms of the impact that gambling can have for individuals and for wider society. So I think it's really important when you're looking at the approaches that you need to take to gambling harms is absolutely recognise what's unique about your own jurisdiction. What are some of the cultural issues perhaps that you need to address locally? But also recognise that you are part of a global ecosystem, a kind of a global gambling industry. So I would really encourage people to, look at what you can learn from other jurisdictions, and importantly, identify what you can teach other jurisdictions as your work is developing as well. There's so much that we can learn from each other. It's really important that we do kind of work together in that way, because ultimately we're all looking for the same sort of outcomes. And I think this increasingly international gambling industry that we are regulating that we're working with does provide greater opportunities for us to work across borders. You know, increasingly working well with many of the people here. You know, Shelley and I regularly work together. Nathan and I have, you know, been spending some good time together over the last few months as well. And, you know, I think in Bermuda, you're incredibly fortunate. You've got a fantastic team of people there. You know, Charmaine, Nathan and colleagues, they really do get this. And, you know, there's an offer from me, and I'm sure, you know, Shelley and others, that we are, you know, here to kind of stand alongside you, support you in your journey, and equally to want to learn from your journey as well. So I'll leave it at that point.
Thank you, Tim. Just to kind of add on, just before moving on to Linda, I think one of the aspects with gaming, I think it's really important to keep into consideration, is to always keep the broad view of what gambling is to begin with. There's a cognitive bias that people have. So first, gambling doesn't correspond to a physical object, so it's harder to conceptualize than, say, alcoholism or other forms of substance abuse. But then also certain forms of gaming are just more or less culturally accepted versus there's a bias to kind of conflate gambling addiction as just casino gaming. But as we know with online gaming, raffles, even though we don't usually perceive something as raffles as being relatively innocent, but from what we know about gambling addiction, most people who are actually diagnosed as having a gaming addiction are exposed to it, gaming from a very young age. So raffles, one component of raffles is just overexposure to children, for example. And then, of course, you know, social media, video game addiction are all related to gambling addiction as well. You can't completely separate them out. So it's critical to have that broader view, and particularly in a day and age where everyone has access to gambling or gambling simulations 5 minutes away on their smartphone or other devices. It's important that when you're approaching these issues that you don't just zero down and collapse the entire issue around what is quote unquote casino gaming. So we discuss at this time, we can turn to Mrs. Linda Graves. Linda is the Executive Director of the National Association of Managers of Disordered Gambling Services. She helped me quite a bit with the implementation of Bermuda's helpline. So I have quite a bit of experience within that field of setting them up. There's direction towards, even with jurisdictions that have outright bans or significantly restrict gambling, still have public resources, just helplines, propping up different institutions to address problem gaming. So at this time, I'd like to turn to Linda Graves.
Thank you, Nathan. It's such a privilege to be on this panel today, so I'm excited to be here. When I hear Shelley and Tim talk, I am so impressed with how immature we are in the United States. And there's a basic reason for that immaturity. And that fact is that we are very independent in the United States. There are 50 states plus Washington, D.C. We have territories like Puerto Rico. Every one of us, every one of those states have the right to decide about what kind of gambling will be in that state. So it's a states' rights issue here in the United States. There is no federal regulation, no federal dollar is ever dedicated to anything pertaining to gambling prevention or gambling treatment, gambling disorders in any way. That is like herding cats when it comes to anything that's coordinated. The National Council on Problem Gambling has been around. This is its 50th anniversary, and they are made up of state councils, grassroots councils that have come to be in the states, and I am unclear about how many member states they have. NAIADIGS, the National Association of Administrators for Disordered Gambling, for whom I am executive director, is an organization that's made up of the administrators of public funds that have been dedicated toward gambling disorder. So they are the state contractors for services for prevention and treatment, research, advocacy, pardon me, not advocacy, but awareness. Because they're state employees, they are unable in the role that they sit in to do advocacy with state government. So that advocacy role is up to the councils, and the contracting role for public monies is left up to the state administrators. So right there, you already have a partnership that works in some states, and in some states it does not work well. Not every state has a state council, nor does every state have a state administrator. So as you can see, coordination among this group of people in the United States is very difficult from the get-go. NAIADIGS, in its role, we have been in existence for 20 years. One of the things that we do is, actually, it's the only organization in the United States that does this. We survey what the services are that are available in each jurisdiction. And we do that periodically. We just completed our 6th survey from 20 years. In the spring of this year, it was released. So what we find is that people don't even cooperate on giving us data. So consequently, when we talk about things like cooperation, when I hear Tim talk about all the places that he cooperates, about the development of the system that's in Ontario, which we've been looking to Ontario for years for research, because there's no funding for research in the United States that is government or state directed necessarily, unless a state chooses to put that research funding. I know Massachusetts particularly has named research dollars in their regulations, but most states do not do that. So even though we've been around, problem gambling has been being addressed in the United States for some 50 years, it is very difficult to coordinate things like research, like common databases. We don't have common databases for collecting helpline information and things like that. And the reason I tell you all this is because you can implement these kinds of things from the start through regulation and not fight the same battles that you see here in the United States, basically. The history of gambling here in the United States has some pertinence to our discussion also, because it has ebbed and flowed through history, you know, whether it was legal, whether it was not. When we formed the United States, separated from Great Britain over 200 years ago, one of the ways that we funded what happened here in the United States was through gaming, through gambling efforts and collecting tax on that. So, you know, it's been here historically, but there were times of prohibition against that. And so it's ebbed and flowed. We're kind of in our 4th wave of gambling now. For instance, in 1975, we only had 2 states that had legalized gambling because it is a states' rights issue. So our casinos have been in Nevada for years, and they were run by the mafia when they were first started there. So those have all been cleaned up, of course. And then New Jersey in 1976 got commercial gambling, so to speak. But in 2000, we had the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act, which changed the whole dynamic of gambling here in the United States. The tribes were through the 70s and forward, were looking at gambling, having gambling availability to the public. And, you know, they butted heads with the state regulators primarily, and they had to work all of that out. But in 1987, we got the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act, which opened the door for tribal gaming as we know it today, which is the huge Las Vegas style casinos. And those, depending on states and what the states decide, we have those 250 operated tribal casinos throughout the United States. We have about 67 of those here in California, where I live. So 29 states have tribal gaming. The lotteries came in 1964 in New Hampshire. Lottery gambling is huge across the United States, but we still have 5 states that do not have lotteries. So there's a huge amount of gambling in the United States of all different types. Of course, our latest wave has been sports betting. In 1992, we had what was called the Professional and Amateur Sports Protection Act passed, and that disallowed sports gaming across the United States, but it was ruled unconstitutional in 2018. So if we think about it, that's only 5 years ago. And one of the reasons it was ruled unconstitutional is because gambling is a states' rights issue, and the federal government had put a law onto the states, which the states kind of rebelled against and eventually overturned. It was overturned. So with the advent of sports betting, there has been a huge surge across the United States. And we now have 33 states that have already passed sports betting in their jurisdictions, with another 19 that have pending legislation. That would only leave 5 states that, if all those 19 pass it, which they may or may not, but if they did, it would leave only 5 states that do not have sports betting. So it's been a huge surge across the United States. So I've been in this field for about 27 years, and I started at a council. I went to a state government where I set up prevention and treatment services. Then I worked for a state council again, and now I'm running a national organization that addresses gambling disorder services. So I've watched this grow and work out over all of these years. One of the things that's absolutely crucial in my mind is that any type of gambling, regardless of what type it is implemented, there must be regulation around contribution to address the problems that arise because of the service that you're offering. Every stakeholder every stakeholder that benefits from the gaming, regardless of whether it prints tickets or makes the equipment or runs the programs, whatever they do, has the brick and mortar buildings, whatever they have, if they gain from the gambling, they must contribute to player safeguards. They must contribute to programs and services that are going to serve those people that may be harmed by the service that they offer. Here we advocate for people having a continuum of service and contributing to that continuum of service, which include awareness and education, prevention services, which Shelley spoke to so eloquently, because prevention is absolutely instrumental. It's hard to get people to see what they're preventing because it didn't happen, but it's absolutely crucial, and it's by far the best dollars that can be spent. It's being proactive instead of reactive. And so I highly advocate for the prevention services. But awareness, education, prevention, treatment, aftercare, which we're just babies in developing aftercare here in the United States, and certainly the research component. And I really commend the Massachusetts legislature for actually putting research in their regulation and in their jurisdiction, because people ignore it. They want the dollars to go to treatment, and that's all great, and we need the dollars to go to treatment. But if you prevent the problem from starting, and then you have the research dollars that say these are best, this didn't work or this did work, these are best practices, where we can establish evidence-based programs and policy, those dollars are well spent because then you're not taking a shotgun approach and doing a bunch of stuff that isn't effective for your people, for your constituency. So we highly advocate for every stakeholder in the gaming industry to contribute to the programming that's needed to address anyone who may cause harms. Now, here in the United States, again, that is not mandated necessarily by jurisdiction, but it can be. We have commercial gaming in some states. Those are regulated by the state directly. Tribal gaming is regulated by the compacts that the tribes have with the states. Everything is regulated separately in a way. The lotteries are, well, it's all states' rights issues, so everything is separate. Again, very difficult for collaboration and to establish national strategies. So that's the role of NAIADIGS that we have adopted in recent years, is that we will try to coordinate some national strategies. We're working on a minimum data set right now for, what is it that we would like to see every state collect in regard to the people that they serve? What kinds of information, so that we have data that we can compare, and you're not comparing apples and oranges. That would be a minimum data set. In other words, this is the minimum that we'd like for you to collect, but there's a lot of things you might want to collect above and beyond that. So we're working on that. So I guess the bottom line is collaboration is huge. And in a place like Bermuda, where you can talk to each other, where you work together, where you're not fragmented, where there's 51 or more jurisdictions. When you have one jurisdiction, it's just imperative that the cooperation is there and that you're in agreement about what it is that you want to do and how you're going to do it. You can use the role models that, the people that you collaborate with them internationally. One of the things that bothers me here in the United States is that we have not learned lessons from places like the United Kingdom. Tim, you guys have made huge progress there in looking at things like advertising and player safeguards. And here, because we're looking at 51 jurisdictions, people may look at that or they may not. And most often they're looking at what the states around them are doing, which may not necessarily be the best example of what they need to do. And so, the whole idea of a strategic report card for your gaming industry, Shelley, it's a wonderful thing, but getting people to say, yes, we'd like to do that. The collaboration. You guys are doing excellent work and I commend you. And again, I think I'm here to say we aren't nearly as developed in the United States, partly because we are so independent that we can't cooperate very well together sometimes. I think that's all I have for you for today. For this portion.
Thank you.
But
Thank you.
Questions.
Yeah, I'll just add on just a few comments before we get to questions and answers. In Bermuda, like other jurisdictions, part of creating a licensing regime is that making sure that every single entity or person that's involved in industry is properly licensed and vetted, so they are able to contribute. In the sense that you mentioned, Linda, I guess if you're engaging in the gambling industry, it's pay to play. It's you need to be contributing. So the licensing isn't just for a brick and mortar establishment. Right. There's licensing for individual machines, for the vendor, if you're the supplier of items to a land-based casino, or a betting shop. There is licensing for you individually want to work within that industry. So there's multiple layers, and that's part of that. If any entity is gaining profits through the gambling industry, it's critical that the licensing regime is structured in such a way that they have to pay to play, if you will. That also goes for advertising. If you are a communications firm, you have contracted with a gambling establishment, you're directly benefiting from designing that communications plan. So there's permits that are involved in that process as well. So yeah, absolutely. That is all absolutely critical. So I guess at this time, I would turn to some of the other attendees here. If so, I'm going to have some backups of my own. But if anyone in the audience, if you like, you just go to the chat and feel free if you have any questions, or you could raise your hand and I could turn on your mic, whichever one you feel comfortable with. If you have any questions at all, please don't hesitate. Okay, so I guess one of the big topics that are in my mind, particularly with online gaming, is its exposure to youth. So a lot of what we've been discussing so far is increasing patron safety for people who are choosing, or adults who are choosing to go online or to a brick and mortar establishment and to game. Of course, the dynamics of it are completely different with youth, I mean, particularly its relationship with video game addiction, easy access through online sports betting is a big one as well. Many people don't recognize fantasy sports, and particularly now with its the expansion of the sports betting industry in the United States. As Linda had alluded to, there's more and more access, including to youth, of gambling services. So I guess within the context specifically just youth, what do you think are the biggest or important to articulate as risks that may not be obvious? Because again, part of the conversation around gambling addiction is to keep the broad view and understand that when we talk about gambling addiction, we're talking about more than just gaming at a casino.
I'd like to speak to that if I might, because that's one of the things that I see as a problem here in the United States. We have Super Bowl in February. It's the largest betting game. It's a national playoff game, and it's the largest betting opportunity. The most money is spent on gambling on that day than any other day in the year. When Super Bowl plays, I watched the Super Bowl. There's an ad with two major sports players, brothers, the Payton brothers, who are famous, and every kid that ever watches football knows who the Payton brothers are. They played for different teams, but both very famous. And they advertise for DraftKings during Super Bowl. Every kid that watched Super Bowl watched that, even in this state of California where sports betting is not legal. Every kid saw those famous people that they know their faces say, this is what you ought to be doing, and you bet with DraftKings. Okay, that happens for that one occasion through the year, but kids see sports betting advertising every place. It's on the shoes, it's on the stadium walls. The stadiums are sponsored by by gaming companies. They see it everywhere. And so you ask yourself, what's a 12-year-old want to do when he grows up? Well, of course, if he can gamble because these famous people do it and it's all part of our culture, if they can do it, why should I have to flip burgers at the hamburger place while I go to college, work really hard to go to college and then may not get a job? Why shouldn't I just aspire to maybe be a football player, but maybe better than that, maybe I just gamble to make my money? And that's the message. There is no, other than small print at the bottom, if you have a gambling problem, call the National Helpline. Other than that, there is no indication that there's any risk involved in that kind of behavior at all. And that's the message that not only our underage gamblers are getting, but also those that are of an age that they can bet on sport. Those people whose frontal lobes are not fully developed yet, and yet they're given all kinds of opportunity to gamble. And that's the number one concern that I have in the United States right now, with sports betting being so prolific and just spreading like wildfire.
Yeah, and Linda, you know, it's not just the United States. RGC, based on its research, has found that this is actually is approaching it. But there's actual evidence out of Australia that proves that influencers, like celebrities, like professional athletes, do have a make a very powerful impression on youth and young adults. And so, I think we're currently developing some advertising, conducting some advertising marketing research globally to inform and provide the industry with leading practices around advertising and marketing. And we will be bringing forward a recommendation that influencers should not be used in gambling advertising because of the profound impact that they have on individuals up to the age of 24. Developing, there's judgment, they're still developing their judgment. But secondly, we also know amongst that age group up to 24 that peers have a tremendous amount of influence, as does competition, and young people will bet more than they can afford because of peer influence as well as celebrity pro athlete influencers. So that's something to really hone in on in terms of prevention education. And we also believe that there's a really important role that parents can play, parents and caregivers can play in terms of talking to their kids about prevention strategies and not to gamble underage, and not to be encouraging kids to gamble underage. That's the other risk, is that gambling is so normalized, particularly in two areas: one, lottery tickets, and secondly, sports betting. People don't even think of it as gambling. You know what? They'll put lottery tickets in kids' Christmas stockings or birthday cards underage, not even thinking about the fact that this is illegal and the ramifications of that. And we know that one of the risks for youth, particularly young underage, is buying scratch tickets.
Right.
So that's one thing, as well as spending extraordinary amounts of money on loot boxes and video games, as well as betting in their friends' basements, that kind of thing. And that's something we need to be aware of. So starting education early is really important. We have programs where we go into schools, we have a digital product, and it's important for parents to have information. And then for 18 to 24-year-olds, a little bit of a different approach. They are legal age, they're more mature, and not quite mature enough yet in terms of the neurological, scientific, behavioral development, but a different approach around ensuring that they're aware of what the responsible gambling tools are, eliminating the stigma associated with responsible gambling tools, and really encouraging them to use it. And what we're seeing is some promising practices is that, there's some tier 1 operators that are really encouraging right on their, opening page. They're integrating the use of tools into the player's experience. So it's like putting on a seatbelt. Before you even start the car and pull out of your driveway, you put that seatbelt on. We want the same kind of approach for responsible gambling tools. Before you start playing, you set your money limits, you set your time limits, etc., so that you don't exceed your budget, as an example.
Absolutely.
So, I would support everything that both Linda and Shelley have said. Really quickly on the point about parents, I think that's a really important one to focus on, because the research from the UK shows that although we have very, very low levels of underage gambling online, in excess of 90% of the people that did gamble online underage, they did so with their parents' account, with their parents' knowledge. So there's a really important point here about empowering and supporting parents to help their young people here. You know, I've got a 17-year-old daughter, and you know, as she was growing up, as a parent, I'm constantly told, talk to your children about the risk of drugs, of smoking, of alcohol. No one ever spoke to me as a parent about talking to my kids about the risks that can come from gambling. And you know, frankly, we've got to do better in terms of supporting parents in that.
Mm-hmm.
And along that line too, other player safeguards with online games, sports betting, e-games, and that is player timeouts, things like that. And again, have those intervals set before they start playing, not once they're engrossed and captivated by the game.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. So yeah, thank you for those comments. We're approaching, we're over an hour now. We're approaching towards the end. So I just want to say thank you to, you know, Shelley, Tim, and Linda for joining us today. You know, you're definitely your expertise and your insight are critical. I mean, particularly as Bermuda is moving within a new space when it comes to gaming regulation. So just to remind everyone again, on the 31st of March, the Bermuda Problem Gaming Council will be doing another webinar, which is more of an introduction, a more layman's perspective on problem and responsible gaming that particularly targets parents. So if you know anyone who's interested in that, tell them to go to www.bgc.bm-webinars in order to register. Expect to see more content in the future. I mean, particularly as the discussion about what gaming regulation in Bermuda evolve, what it will look like in the future, how do we implement it now? As that conversation continues to evolve, the problem and responsible gaming pace will continue on its own. So though that's connected, related to licensing, it's important to understand as a bucket of work, as a field of compliance, as I said before, that it's distinct and unto itself, that it's important that we're ahead of the game, if you will, that the structures to address problem gaming are in place and are operational prior to the opening of any of a land-based casino establishment. So again, I want to thank you all for coming out today. Thank you, Tim, Shelley, and Linda. Expect to hear from me here pretty soon because they were ready to rock and roll here in Bermuda and get everything up and running. Okay.
I have one more comment in regard to what you just said, and that is to talk and implement training of those brick and mortar casinos, the employees prior to opening. Make sure they know the signs and symptoms of gambling problems and what their responsibility is in addressing that.
Absolutely, yes. And that's a legal requirement as well under the regulatory apparatus that we have here. So there's lots of movement within that space, not just within casino gaming. So again, in many places, online gaming is more or less a gray market. I mean, the example I like to use, there's only 2 U.S. states that have blanket bans on gambling. Blanket bans on gambling, which would be Utah and Hawaii, ironically. Of all places, the #1 fight out of Hawaii is to Las Vegas.
Las Vegas. That's exactly
so right. Yeah, in an interconnected world, it's important to understand that to connect problem and responsible gaming exclusively to just casino gaming is kind of putting your head in the sand. And that in order to move forward, again, taking a broad view of what gambling is and what kind of games, what kinds of lines of business we're seeking to address. Okay. So thank you all for coming out today. This has been an excellent discussion. If you have any further additional questions, please don't hesitate to contact myself or to learn more at the about problem responsible gaming, I'm more than happy to jump on the phone, meet in person over coffee, discuss about these matters, and see what we can do to move further and advancing an infrastructure to address problem gaming. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.